be back in Belgrade. I was here a year ago, and I note with pleasure that the Institute has been considerably spruced up, renovated since I was here the last time. So congratulations on that, and thanks for inviting me. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here this morning. I have a PowerPoint, but I don't think there is any point in sort of starting it, because it's a very basic, primitive PowerPoint, and there's a printout which is just as good, except for the fact that the photograph isn't in color. But on the other hand, I have a book here, so I thought, could you please pass it around so you can have a look at it. It's a very slim volume. Since we are so few here, I suggest that if you think there's something unclear or so on, as I talk, you interrupt me and ask questions. And I would also like to suggest that Voyin gives a sort of longer response to my talk, because I know Voyin has been sort of thinking a lot about my and Julian's work on moral enhancement. Now, I think most of us would agree that moral enhancement, it's better if we were morally better than we actually are, because that would mean that fewer sort of crimes like murders, thefts, rapes, and so on would be committed, and more good deeds would be performed. Now, what I'm going to argue is that because of the development of modern technology and modern society, it's become even more important than that people are morally better, because our means, our powers of actions are so much greater nowadays. And the basic point of this argument is, I put it in 5 points on this handout. And the first point is that it's easier for us to harm each other than to benefit each other. Now, you live in a densely populated area. Many of you, perhaps all of you, have access to a car. Whenever you're out driving, you can just plow into a crowd and you can kill dozens of people, just like that. But I bet very few of you had had the opportunity of saving dozens of people. That requires that you're put in a very peculiar, special situation, where, say, many people's lives are under threat, and it's a threat you can avert. Otherwise, you can't save that many people. But it's much easier to kill people. So that is an example which illustrates the first aspect of this claim, namely that the magnitude of the harm caused can be greater than the magnitude of the benefits provided. We can kill more individuals than we can save the lives of. There's a second aspect to it, and that is that there are normally many more means or ways of causing harm of a given magnitude than of benefiting to the same degree. For instance, there are many more ways of disturbing a functioning system, an organism, for instance, than of improving it to the same extent. That is because an organism, a healthy organism, is a very complicated system of interacting parts. And if you tinker with one of those parts, you will disturb sort of the health of the organism. Whereas it's much more difficult to improve on it, because that requires sort of putting something which sort of fits in very well in this complicated interactive system. And the fact that it's there are more ways for things to go wrong is the explanation of what it's called entropy. The fact that things tend to degenerate, tend to develop towards disorder, chaos, and so on. And that's simply because there are so many more ways for things to go wrong than for things to go in an orderly fashion. So the probability is much greater than that something will turn out for the worse. So now, it's one thing to kill a human being. It's another thing to harm it. But if we're assuming that life is good, then killing an organism, killing a human being, is a way of harming it. By this act, I mean, suppose this being would have gone on leading a good life. If we kill that human being, we would deprive it of all that goodness that future life has in store for it. In contrast, if we were to save his life, save the life of this human being, we can't claim credit for all the goodness that the future has in store, because that goodness depends on many other conditions to come about. Whereas if we kill it, I mean, that is preventing everything that's good in the future. So that's another way of bringing out that it's much easier to harm a being than it is to benefit it. Now, the second point is that as scientific technology increases our powers of action, our capacity to cause harm is magnified to the point at which we can cause ultimate harm, what we call ultimate harm, that is, make worthwhile life forever impossible on this planet. Now, as scientific technology increases our power of action, of course, it is the case that our power to do good, to benefit, also increases. But our power to harm always maintains its lead. It's always greater. And now we've reached a point where we can cause this what we call ultimate harm. As I said, if we prevent a life, a worthwhile life, a good life, from continuing, we're preventing all the goodness that's in store for a being. Now, if we were to do something that puts an end to all life on Earth, which otherwise could have gone on for thousands and thousands of years, billions and billions of organisms could have led good lives. Now, if we cause ultimate harm, we prevent all that goodness. So it's a tremendous harm we can cause if we put an end to life forever on this planet. Now, scientific development, modern scientific technology, has put us in the position where we can cause ultimate harm. And we discussed two ways of how ultimate harm can be brought about. One is weapons of mass destructions, and we discuss nuclear and biological weapons of mass destructions. Now, nuclear weapons have been around since the Second World War, when the United States of America dropped atom bombs on Japan at the end of the Second World War. And more countries have developed this capacity to produce nuclear weapons. And as you know, today there's a big issue about whether Iran is trying to trying to develop nuclear weapons. But so far, although we've had nuclear weapons for about 70 years or something, nobody's used them. And one reason for that is presumably what used to be called terror balance, that nations are deterred by the fact that if they launch a nuclear attack, the other side would revenge and sort of annihilate them. Now, a problem is, this is true of nations, but we're now approaching a point where a well-organized terrorist group can develop nuclear weapons, although it's a technically rather advanced procedure. Now, that would pose a much greater threat because, first, a terror group mightn't be afraid of retaliation, they might be prepared to die. And secondly, they're much harder to target than a nation is. So if a terrorist group were to acquire nuclear weapons, that would be a much greater threat, I think. Moreover, there is the possibility of biological weapons of mass destruction. For instance, some years ago, some Australian scientists developed, modified a strain of mousepox so that it became lethal in almost 100% of cases. Now, mousepox is very similar to smallpox, and the scientists who manipulated mousepox, they sort of publicized this information on the internet, so it was widely available. Now, if some terrorists were to, some capable terrorists were to get hold of information like that, they could, in principle, manipulate smallpox, make it lethal in 100% of cases, and travel around the world and deposit the virus in airport terminals and other places where there are lots and lots of people who move about. So in that way, thousands and thousands of people could be infected straight away. And as the incubation time for smallpox is 1-2 weeks, these people would be able to infect thousands and thousands of other people before it's discovered. And if it's a new strain of smallpox, there mightn't be vaccination against it. So this is a way of causing a pandemic. So that's another illustration of the possibility of causing great harm, perhaps not ultimate harm, because it wouldn't be possible to wipe out all human beings or creatures on Earth in that way. And then there's another main way of causing ultimate harm, and that's climate change and environmental destruction. As it is, I mean, scientific development has enabled us to utilize natural resources so efficiently. So we've been able to colonize the whole planet, and the human population has grown to 7 billion. And in the middle of this century, it's estimated to be around between 9 and 10 billion people. Now, as it is already, I mean, we are using too much of the Earth's resources. It's been estimated that in 8 months we use up all the resources that the Earth takes a year to produce. and we exhaust so many waste products, so which the Earth needs a year to absorb. So one might say in 8 months we use a year of the Earth's resources. That's the human imprint in it. So already as it is, we're sort of over-exploiting the resources of the Earth. And this is sort of includes use of natural resources. It includes emission of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. So the human imprint on Earth is dependent on 3 factors. One is the size of the population, one is the per capita level of welfare or gross domestic product, or however you want to count it. And the third is the efficiency of technology, how much welfare you can get out of a certain amount of natural resources. The more efficient technology is, the more welfare you can get out of a certain amount of resources. Now, if we were to sort of reduce our use of natural resources, so it's no longer over-exploited, that would take a very drastic reduction. Some has claimed it would take a reduction of 90% of a reduction of emission of carbon dioxide. The problem is that in the past so far, whenever technology has become more efficient, it's always been the case that we've used that to increase our consumption. And there's a strong reason to believe that that will happen in the future as well. And the reason for that is global inequality. The fact that the countries of the world are so dissimilar. Now let's compare just the 2 biggest emitters of carbon dioxide, namely China and the United States. The population of China is roughly 4 times as big as the population of the United States. The population of China is 1.2 billion, 300 million of the United States. But the emissions per capita in the US is 4 or 5 times as high as it is in China. Now, so that's a very unequal situation between those 2 countries. And it's also the case that in the past, the United States have contributed much more to depositing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 3 or 4 times as much as China has done. So China could claim sort of the right to greater emissions in the future for that reason. But even if we put that aside, I mean, consider the problem of creating equality between China and the US as regards emission of carbon dioxide. I mean, it would be disastrous for the climate if China were to sort of increase their emissions to the same level as the United States per capita. So the only way to bring about an equality here would be for the US to reduce their emissions by, say, 80%. Now, that seems incredibly unlikely that would happen. The political climate in the US would be totally rule out that. So there is a sort of a great problem about this over-exploitation of the earth and how to handle it. So humanity, although modern science scientific development has put in our hands the means of creating very good life for all of us, it seems that the threat to humankind is greater than it ever been. A very well-known British scientist, Martin Rees, who was chairman of the Royal Society for Sciences in England, he sort of estimated it roughly that there's a 50% chance that a human civilization won't survive the present century. Now, even if we think that's an exaggeration, if we compare that, the risk that sort of ultimate harm might be caused now to what it was before human beings acquire that capacity, when only supervolcanoes and hits by massive asteroids could cause ultimate harm. I mean, those are very, very rare occasions. They would happen once 100,000 years or something like that. So it is the fact that because of modern science, the threat to humankind is greater than, the future of humankind is greater than it's ever been. Now, so what we have is, one might say, a mismatch between our capacity of action and our powers of action, which modern science has put in our hands, and our moral capacity. We hypothesize that, now I've sort of reached the third point, that our moral psychology and morality have evolved to make us fit for life in small, close-knit societies with limited technology, which allows us to influence only immediate surroundings in the imminent future. Now, these are conditions that human beings have lived under almost all of the 150,000 years or so human beings have existed. Modern human beings roughly in the sort genetically like us. And it's only about sort of 100 years or so we've been living in this huge societies with sort of remarkable technology and so on. So our psychology, our moral psychology and common sense morality has been designed for an entirely different sort of situation. Now, we have a sort of list of features what we think makes us unsuitable to handle the powers of modern technology. First, a bias towards the near future. That means that we care more about the near future than the more distant future. Imagine you have to do something unpleasant in the future. Say you have to go to the dentist or something, if that's unpleasant. Now, I mean, if you don't have a toothache, it's just sort of... If the dentist calls you and says, well, unfortunately, I will have to postpone your appointment a day or so, most of us with a sigh of relief. We think it's a good thing if something unpleasant is sort of put further in the future. The opposite is true of good things. We want the good things to be close to us, not in the distance. To some extent, this sort of bias is rational if it's based on the probabilities, namely that the probability of something more further in the future is less probable. In that case, it's rational to be less concerned about it. But the bias towards the near is much steeper than that. I mean, if something is unpleasant, is postponed just for a day or so, the probability of it happening won't be significantly affected, but it might still make quite a lot of difference to our feelings. We might be relieved, and if it is a good thing, we might be irritated, impatient, and we want the time to go faster. Now, it's obvious that this bias towards the future is very important as regards climate change, because the worst effects of climate change, they will kick in a more distant future, say more than 20 years in the future. Now, because it's so distant, we're bound to feel that it's less important. And of course, politicians, they can sort of reason like this: well, suddenly it is a great threat that there would be this sort of calamitous consequences of our present policies and so on. But that will happen when I'm out of office, when I'm dead even. The important thing for me is to win the next election. So they can safely put aside sort of those long-term effects. The second point is our parochial altruism. An altruism which extends only to kin and people we're personally acquainted with, and which is limited by xenophobia. Many thinkers, philosophers, and psychologists have thought human beings are egoists, but that isn't particularly plausible if you look on things from an evolutionary point of view, or even from the point of view of common sense, because it's quite obvious that, say, people care about their children, and that makes perfect evolutionary sense, because that's a way of their genes to go on existing. And it's also the case that people care about friends and so on. There is something psychologists call the exposure effect, which means that if you're exposed to something quite a lot and nothing untoward or nothing unpleasant happens, you get to like it, you get accustomed to it, and you begin to like it and feel sympathy with it. So, I mean, there's a tendency for us to like people we see every day if we don't have conflicts with them and so on. But similarly, there is a tendency not to put a limit to this sort of sympathy. It's a deep feature of human nature to distinguish between an in-group and an out-group. A group of near and dear ones, and an out-group, which one doesn't care about. And that, again, is something which makes perfectly good evolutionary sense, because if we were to make favors to strangers indiscriminately, we might easily be screwed, as it sometimes. I mean, the people might cheat us, and there would be free riders who would take advantage of our kindness and so on. Now, this parochial altruism makes it possible for us to solve cooperation problems in smaller groups. There is a well-known cooperation problems called the tragedy of the commons. I mean, we can imagine a small village of herdsmen who all have cattle, and those cattle, and they graze the common pastures. Now, suppose the pastures are quite fertile and so on, so the herds grow and so on. Eventually, they're so numerous, they cause overgrazing of the pastures. So if they're not reduced in number, that would mean overgrazing and eventually starvation for the whole village. So it's rational for all the herdsmen could cut down a bit on the number of their herds to prevent this overgrazing. But it isn't. I mean, it's rational for a single herdsman to reduce the number of his cattle only if other herdsman does it as well. Because if he were to reduce his number and most other herdsmen wouldn't do anything about it, there would still be overgrazing, and he would just lose by having cut down the number of his cattle. So it's rational to cut down the grassing of your creatures only if you can trust that other people will do the same, because that's the only way to prevent overgrazing. Now, in a small community, people might know each other so well, they know they can trust each other and so on. But if we look at a global situation, that isn't the case. And so, for instance, if we take climate change, I mean, different countries and different ideologies, very dissimilar countries, they don't trust each other. They think, well, it's useless for us to reduce our emissions and so on, because we can't trust that other countries will do the same. So, I mean, and we reason the same way when we think about using our car. So it would be useless for me not to use my car, because other people will still use their cars. And so we all go on driving, and then we cause this pollution, because we can't trust each other, because we can't cooperate. Now, the possibility of cooperation is greater in smaller groups, but now we're talking about a global situation, and cooperation is very, very difficult to achieve because of this limited parochial altruism. There's a related feature, let's see on the handout. This is an incapacity to feel proportionate sympathy with larger numbers of sufferers. Now, we're perfectly capable, most of us, if we're not psychopaths or autists or something, to feel sympathy with a single individual we see suffering from pain or something. Instinctively, we sort of feel pain ourselves and so on. But if we hear on the news about 1,000 people somewhere suffering from something, we won't feel sympathy which is 1,000 times as strong. We will probably feel perhaps not even as much sympathy for those 1,000 people as we feel for a single individual close to us. But we can't sort of feel a sympathy in sort of which is proportionate to large numbers of sufferers. We can feel proportionate sympathy for a single one or two sufferers, and so on, but our sympathy, the feeling of sympathy, doesn't grow as in the same way as the number of sufferers might grow. Now, this is, of course, a great difficulty because now, in the present situation, because we do have the means of alleviating a lot of suffering in Africa or wherever, but because of this limitation on our sympathy, we don't care enough to do it. A related thing is something that's called the act-omission doctrine, that harming is harder to justify than failing to benefit. I mean, we think it's sort of a much more serious wrong to kill somebody than to fail to save that person. I mean, this is something which is codified in the most laws, the laws of most nations. It's a very serious crime to kill somebody. But quite often, this is true of Sweden, for instance, it's no crime at all not to save anyone's life. I mean, if you see somebody bleeding to death, you're not legally required to do anything. You can just let them bleed to death. But of course you can't, if you stab somebody and then let them bleed to death, it's an entirely different matter. So there's an enormous difference between how we say look upon harming and benefiting. And this is related, I think, to the fact that it's so much easier to harm than to benefit. Because it's so much easier to harm, it's been more and more important to put a barrier to harming. So we have this sort of this feeling that it's more and more wrong to harm than it is to fail to benefit. Now, this is connected. This doctrine, active mission doctrine, is connected with the last point, which is that our sense of responsibility is based on a causation, it's proportionate to a causal contribution. We intuitively, we don't think we are causes of harm that we just let occur, that we don't bring about. I mean, the same thing happens as would happen if I hadn't been present at all at this scene. The person would have drowned. So we see it as we don't causally contribute to this person's death if we just let it happen. Similarly, if we cause something together with other people, so walk across a lawn, which many other people do, and eventually destroy the lawn, or drive our cars, releasing a small amount of carbon dioxide. But many other people do it as well. We feel in those situations we're only responsible for the tiny bit we cause. We don't sort of see ourselves as somebody who contributes to that greatly devastating effect, which we all cause together. We just sort of concentrate on what we do, and we say that our own contribution is negligible. So we think we're not very responsible for the bad things that happen, which is a mistake. And of course, this is extremely important as well for climate change, because we all tend to think that what I do won't make any difference, but what we together do makes all the difference. So this is the final sort of feature of our moral psychology, which makes it unsuitable for this situation we're in now. So we have this sort of mismatch between our huge capacities for action and our moral capacity. So now, two things we can do. We could, in principle, get rid of all technology and so on, but that wouldn't be a good thing, because we can't do without advanced technology if we are going to be able to provide a population of 7 billion, and probably at least 9 billion in 2050, with a decent standard of life. So what we need instead is a moral enhancement to counteract those features I've sort of listed, and thus to prevent us from causing ultimate harm with modern technology. Now, end of the road. Fifth point. We have traditional cultural means of moral enhancement, but they mightn't be effective enough. So we should explore whether our expanding knowledge of neurobiology could supply us with biomedical means of moral enhancement. Now, if we look on sort of our moral development through history, we sort of say we compare ourselves to people of ancient Greek 2,000 years ago. I mean, if we look on what has happened to technology, the difference is enormous, because the scientific development has occurred during 2,000 years or more. But if we look on how people morally behave, I think the difference is much smaller. Clearly, there's been some moral progress. For instance, slavery was widely accepted in ancient Greece. Today we believe in a belief in human equality is widespread. But even though that's true, I mean, there's still, that's to a rather great extent sort of people paying lip service to this doctrine, because there are quite a lot of things going on in the world which are incompatible with human equality. Even in Europe, things like trafficking, there are outbreaks of genocide now and then, and so on. So, although it's undoubtedly true that there has been moral development by traditional cultural means, it has been sort of rather small compared to the technological development. Now we need a much quicker moral enhancement to deal with our situation. So therefore we're proposing that we should explore the possibilities of using our more extensive knowledge of neurobiology and scientific knowledge, which we've used to change the world, we should use to change ourselves. In principle, it's possible, because say something like altruism or sympathy seems clearly to have a biological genetic basis, and this is one piece of evidence for this claim is that most scientists, psychologists would say that it's evident that women in general are more altruistic, sympathetically inclined than men are. And it's also the case that the most promising drug, oxytocin, affects sympathy altruism. This is a natural hormone which is sort of released by sex and touching and so on, naturally. But it can also be, you can give people it in the form of nasal spray. Now, this drug has been found to make people more kinder to other people. Unfortunately, it's also the case that this sort of kindness to other people seems confined to the in-group. It doesn't extend to the out-group. So I think that is a reason why that's something which goes to show that by itself this drug won't be enough. You need moral education as well, to education showing that the differences between my own group and the other out-group isn't morally significant. So I think it isn't the case that moral enhancement by biomedical means could replace traditional cultural means. But I think it can aid it. I think some people are very low in altruism and sympathy and so on, and they could get a boost by biomedical means. So, but although we're sort of toying with this idea, we're also aware of that there are problems. we discussed a bootstrapping problem and the risk which is due to the fact that the people who will have to use this sort of new means biomedical knowledge, they're morally imperfect themselves, and they might misuse it as they misuse other pieces of technology. So there is no guarantee that if such means were developed, they would be used properly. So unfortunately we don't have any